Hi, I'm Joe, a Warsaw-based shooting instructor. In today's video, I'm going to describe the firing sequence of the MG42 machine gun, a sequence which can occur up to 20 times per second in order to achieve the legendary rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute. First, I'll give an overview of the main stages of the firing sequence, and then I'll discuss each major subcomponent separately, so stay tuned. When the trigger is pulled, the sear drops, allowing the bolt to move forward under the pressure of the recoil spring. As the bolt moves forward, the bolt head strips a fresh round out of the belt, which is then guided into the chamber by the curved depressor plate located inside the top cover. As the bolt continues forward, it enters the barrel extension, where a series of ramps cut into the extension force the bolt rollers outward, allowing the firing pin to come forward and ignite the cartridge. As the round is fired, a recoil impulse pushing backwards against the bolt is generated, which, since the bolt is still engaged with the barrel extension, causes both the bolt and barrel to travel backwards in unison. This recoil impulse is aided by the booster cone located inside the flash hider, which traps exhaust gas behind it as the bullet leaves the barrel, causing the pressure of the exhaust gas to press against the front face of the barrel bushing, which imparts additional energy to the recoil impulse. This gas is then vented out through the holes of the flash hider. As the barrel and bolt recoil together, the bolt rollers will hit two ramps located inside the receiver, causing the bolt rollers to move inwards, retracting the firing pin and unlocking the bolt and the barrel. It is at this stage the large spring located inside the receiver, called the recuperator spring, forces the barrel back to its firing position while the bolt continues its rearward travel. The extractor pulls the spent case out of the chamber, which is then ejected out of the ejection port when the rear of the bolt strikes the buffer spring, causing the transfer bar located inside the bolt body to hit the ejector, which kicks the case out of the gun, like so. At this point, the recoil spring pushes the bolt forward and the firing sequence is repeated until the trigger is released, the sear resets, and the bolt locks back, cocked, ready to fire. It is important to remember that since the ejector does not have a dedicated spring, as on an AR-15, when extracting a cartridge manually using the charging handle, you must pull the bolt back hard enough to ensure the case ejects, otherwise it will stay on the bolt face, making your life much more difficult than it ought to be. The trigger group on this particular gun has been modified to fire in semi-auto only. allowing this gun to be classified as a sports rifle instead of a machine gun. This was accomplished by adding several extra bits into the trigger group, which causes the sear to reset after every shot. Normally, in the full auto trigger group, pulling the trigger simply causes the sear to drop down, and the trigger holds the sear down until you let go of the trigger, and the sear comes back up and catches the bolt. On many machine guns, the trigger group consists of just the trigger and the sear, but on the MG42 full auto trigger group, a disconnector has been added which does two things. First, it physically holds down the sear while the gun is being fired, and second, when you release the trigger, the sear does not reset until the bolt body comes back, trips the disconnector, and then the sear rises and catches the bolt. I'll include photos of both this semi-auto trigger group as well as an original trigger group for comparison. It's worth noting that both the trigger group and the feed mechanism of the MG42 were copied in the M240 and the M249 SAW, among other machine guns. When the bolt is outside of the barrel extension, the bolt rollers are pressed inwards, which locks the firing pin holder in the rear position. When the bolt rollers are pushed outwards by the cuts in the barrel extension, the firing pin holder is allowed to move forward and ignite the primer. So, closed, open, closed, open. Close, open, closed, open, closed, open. Once the rollers are locked into the barrel extension, the lockup between the bolt and the barrel is extremely solid, and there is no play in that. So, locked, unlocked, locked, unlocked. Here, we can see the cuts in the barrel extension that force the bolt rollers outward. Moving next to the receiver, here we can see the two ramps that push the bolt rollers inwards as the gun recoils, thus unlocking the bolt and the barrel extension. And right here, we can see the recuperator spring, which pushes the barrel back into its forward firing position. Here we can see how the barrel recoils with the bolt until the bolt unlocks from the barrel extension, at which point the recuperator pushes the barrel back to its forward firing position. When the rear of the bolt body hits the buffer spring, the transfer bar located inside the bolt body gets pushed forward and hits the ejector, which kicks the spent casing out of the ejection port in the receiver. Here's the transfer bar. And then the bolt. Just like this. And when it hits, the round ejects. In the bolt's original configuration, the recoil spring alone is what pushed the firing pin forward when the bolt rollers opened. However, this created a situation where, when the bolt locked into the barrel extension, it was possible that the rollers could bounce inwards at the moment the cartridge detonated, resulting in an out-of-battery explosion. To remedy this, the anti-bounce spring was invented so that now the firing pin holder was pushed forward by that spring instead of just the recoil spring. The anti-bounce spring has been incorporated on virtually all post-war iterations of the MG42 platform and should be applied on any guns not so equipped. When the cartridge is fired, the exhaust gases get trapped behind the booster cone, which causes pressure to build up against the face of the barrel bushing and the barrel, imparting additional energy to the recoil impulse of the gun. The gas is then vented out through the holes in the flash hider. I should also mention that there are different sizes of booster cone in use, with larger or smaller diameter holes, which can affect how much gas gets trapped inside the booster cone, allowing one to tune the gas system to a limited extent. The Yugoslavian's gunner's kit includes a purpose-built scraper for cleaning the carbon out of the inside of the booster cone. So, the booster cone fits over the barrel bushing, which reciprocates back and forth, and sits inside the flash hider. You can see how the gas vents out. To put it all back together, take your barrel bushing, insert it into the muzzle, lift up the flash hider lock. You can see how the barrel bushing reciprocates, and it's locked in place by the flash hider lock. Take your booster cone and your flash hider. Screw it on. Open the barrel gate. Insert the barrel and press down to overcome the recuperator spring. When the barrel bushing moves far enough rearwards, the gas vents in the booster cone are exposed and the gas is able to vent out through the holes in the flash hider. One of the changes made between the MG42 and the MG3 that is often overlooked was the simplification of the booster cone and flash hider into a single part, which is why the MG3 flash hider has such a different shape from the MG42 flash hider. As the bolt moves forward, the feed mechanism roller on the rear of the bolt causes the feed mechanism lever to move to the left. This causes the outer feed pulls to move to the right, pushing the next cartridge against the cartridge stop on the feed tray, while at the same time the inner feed pulls fold down over the belt and come back up. When the bolt moves backwards, the feed mechanism lever moves to the right, which causes the inner feed pull to advance the belt slightly, while the outer feed pulls fold down and over the next cartridge, in anticipation of the next firing sequence. In this way, the belt advances both when the bolt comes forward and when the bolt goes back, thus dividing the feeding sequence into two halves. So, forward, back. And here's a close-up of the feed pulls. The MG42 can be loaded in a few different ways depending on whether the bolt is in battery or cocked, the top cover is open or closed, and whether or not starter tabs are used. It is important to understand how the feed mechanism works in order to avoid damaging the feed mechanism, belts, or ammunition, and I'll show you the one specific way that the weapon must never be loaded. The standard way of carrying the MG42, when outside of the most urgent tactical situations, is with the bolt in battery on an empty chamber and with the belt loaded and the safety disengaged. This way, when you're ready to fire, you simply cock the gun, and the first cartridge is advanced over the feedway and ready for the bolt to strip. If starter tabs are used, they can simply be pulled through the feed mechanism with the top cover closed. If loading the gun with the bolt in battery, pull the starter tab through the feed mechanism until you hear 2 clicks as the cartridge travels under the feed pulls. And the first cartridge will stop just to the left of the feedway. When ready to fire, cock the bolt, and the cartridge will now be against the cartridge stop, under the depressor plate, and over the feedway. If loading with the bolt cocked and the top cover closed, pull the starter tab through the feed mechanism until you hear 2 clicks, and the cartridge will be against the cartridge stop. Make sure that you pull the cartridge all the way through so that it is sitting under the depressor plate and over the feedway. Otherwise, the cartridge will not feed when the trigger is pulled. If loading the weapon without starter tabs, leave the first 3 links empty to act as an improvised starter tab. When loading without starter tabs, the weapon can only be loaded with the top cover open, and here is where we can run into trouble. As a general rule, only load the weapon with the top cover open when the bolt is cocked. With the bolt cocked, you simply pull the belt against the cartridge stop and close the top cover. If you are loading the gun with the top cover open and the bolt and battery, this is where you can run into problems. Firstly, the cartridge must be placed to the left of the feedway, and it must be placed in exactly the right position, or you won't be able to close the top cover. Now here's the dangerous part. If you load the first cartridge against the cartridge stop with the bolt and battery, when you cock the gun, the feed mechanism will attempt to push the cartridge forward against the stop, but since it can't move any further, you will either damage the cartridge, the belt, the feed mechanism, or maybe all 3. So, make your life easy and only load the gun with the top cover open, with the bolt cocked, and preferably the safety engaged. When you load the first cartridge against the cartridge stop of the feed tray, with the bolt locked to the rear, note that when you fire the gun, the forward motion of the bolt does not move the feed mechanism lever until just after the bolt head strips a cartridge from the belt. One benefit of this is that the mechanism is not simultaneously trying to strip the round and pull the belt at the same time, thus distributing these forces to different points in the cycle to avoid robbing too much energy from the recoil spring at one time. Conversely, when the bolt travels backwards, all the movement in the feed mechanism is accomplished at the very start of the recoil impulse, again, avoiding robbing the recoil impulse of the needed energy to cycle the gun. Anyhow, if you load the first round against the cartridge stop with the bolt and battery, when you go to charge the gun by pulling the charging handle, you are causing the feed mechanism to try and advance that cartridge against the cartridge stop, but since the cartridge is stuck against the cartridge stop, it can't move and something will break. When you pull the starter tab through the feed mechanism with the top cover closed and the bolt and battery, you want to hear 2 clicks. First, the dummy link in the belt going through the inner feed pole, and then the first cartridge going through the outer feed pole. Then, when you cock the gun, the first cartridge gets pushed under the depressor plate and against the cartridge stop of the feed tray. And now you know the firing sequence of the MG42 machine gun. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Check out my machine gun instruction playlist and follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/SurviveWithJoe. Leave your questions in the comments and I'll try to answer them in a future video. Thanks for watching.